Well, gentlemen, listening to Rick, that's a pretty hard act to follow, I'd have to say. I was a great footballer myself, but not recognised by coaches sufficiently. None of you know this. None of you know this, and you're all about to learn it. My grandfather, who's my mother's father, is in the Norwood Football Club Hall of Fame. I'd like you to know that. So it's time our family started boasting about its football record. Sure, I was in the Crayfors primary school team. We won occasionally. I was the full forward. But I don't know, for some reason was never recognised, as I've said after that. But thank you very much for having me this evening. It's a tremendous honour to come along to your annual dinner, for an annual dinner to celebrate such a wonderful school. You are amongst the most privileged people in this state, let's face it. Dare I say it, you and people who have been to Saints and other schools like that. Saints, that's St Peter's College, it's sort of up the road a bit. You are hugely privileged. It's a wonderful school. It has great resources, it has great teachers, and it's produced great leaders. And my task tonight is to say a little bit to you late into the night about the issue of leadership. Last Sunday, I decided, my wife is away at the moment. You're wondering what I'm going to say next. No, I didn't decide to do that. I decided to stay at home at night on my own, open a bottle of wine and watch the cricket. And I knew, of course, that if I switched over to Foxtel, I could watch the British Open and watch Adam Scott. And I was thinking about this, and your school so much comes to mind, because it occurs to me that Adam Scott's father, who I discovered tonight is called Philip, Adam Scott's father went to this school. And Adam Scott would have gone to Prince's had it not been for his father moving up to Queensland. So you can kind of claim him, and he did quite well that night. But was there anyone from Prince's playing in the Australian cricket team that night? And the answer is no. And when you look at let's be frank about this, the simply appalling performance, appalling is a good word to use here, the appalling performance of the Australian cricket team on Sunday night. I mean, I just did switch to the golf, and at least got to bed early, which is what the Australian team should have done as well. But watching that team reminded me of something about it, and some of you won't agree with this. That is a team which lacks, this is controversial, it lacks real leadership. There's a lack of leadership in that team. And I know England have been training a lot, and Australian coaches have been teaching them to play cricket. It's kind of depressing, that, isn't it? I mean, I know they've been doing that, but every team depends on a strong leader. Now, in my time in politics, I spent nearly 12 years as the Foreign Minister of Australia. I had the opportunity of meeting a large number of leaders, and people often ask me about this. When you think of the people you've met, what leaders would you describe as great? And I'm going to answer that question for you tonight, but I'm also going to answer it by telling you a little bit about leaders who I thought fell slightly short of greatness. And no, in the interests of bipartisanship, this is not going to be a speech tonight about Kevin Rudd. And I know he'll be disappointed we're not really talking about him tonight. But, and I know some of you are Labor and some of you are Liberal and your school colour's red, and so, you know, I'm very cautious in what I say here. Well, you have produced a lot of politicians. They've been predominantly Liberal politicians, but you have produced a couple of Labor politicians as well. So it shows what a good bipartisan school you are. So some of these leaders I found were, if you like, just completely disconnected. I remember going to Saudi Arabia a few years ago. I can say this now because this leader is dead. And I went to see King Fahd, his brother. His brother is now the king, King Abdullah. So I went to see King Fahd. Before I went in to have this audience with the King of Saudi Arabia, his official said to me, "Minister, you just keep talking. He won't say a lot to you and he won't ask you a lot of questions. You're not kidding. So I go in to see this guy. He's sitting there on a throne. And I bow to him as you would, you know, if you're going to see the Queen or someone like that. He's a king, so I bowed to him deferentially because deference comes very naturally to me. How do you do, Your Majesty? And I sat down next to him. And he looked at me, and he looked at me with a slightly glassy look in his eye, I'd have to say. And he said to me, "You are very welcome." I thought, well, welcome? Well, thank you very much. I said, "It's wonderful to be here, Your Majesty," and talked to him about my agenda. "These are the things I'm doing while I'm here in Saudi Arabia, Your Majesty." And he looked at me again and he just said, "You are very welcome." And I'm beginning to get starting to sweat. So I started to talk about an idea I had, which is still something the Australian government pushes, which is to build education relationships with Saudi Arabia. And so I talked about the great universities we have, the great schools we have. I don't know if you have any Saudis studying at Prince's, but the great schools that we have here and the great opportunities for them to spend huge amounts of money in Australia getting educated. And he looked at me again, glassy-eyed, and he said, "You are very welcome." So I'm thinking, this guy's not a great leader, and that's what I'm telling you. So I thought, well, thank you very much. After 10 minutes, "Thank you very much, Your Majesty. Great to see you. Thank you. It's fantastic." As they say nowadays, got to zip. And he just turned to me and said, "You are very welcome." So what do I say about a leader like that? Sadly, he was losing it, and he disappeared off to his maker not very long after that. So at a similar time, I went to see an Indian Prime Minister who is still alive, though he's not the Prime Minister anymore, an elderly man called Vajpayee, and a real sort of Indian nationalist. And this wasn't long after the war in Afghanistan had begun. And I have to say, this is the man who is the Prime Minister, a Prime Minister of a country of 1 billion people. This is a hugely important leader. And it's interesting to think about how someone like that gets into a position of such immense power, because this man was almost completely mute. You know how it is when you get into a room with somebody and they're just the two of you, and you feel under obligation to make conversation. There's that whole notion of the embarrassing silence. This guy, Vajpayee, he was the master of the embarrassing silence. So I'd sit down there, I'm a jolly sort of person, as you can tell, listening to me. I chat away. I can tell you all sorts of things about all sorts of stuff, as I did with the poor old Indian Prime Minister. And he just sat there and said nothing. At one point I thought, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens if I say nothing. So I said nothing as well, so it's just complete silence. Like after 2 minutes, the ambassador's nudging me and whispering in my ear, "I think, Minister, you ought to say something," because this silence is getting a little embarrassing. I'm sweating with embarrassment. I turned to the Indian Prime Minister. "We have troops in Afghanistan. I'm worried about Afghanistan." And I said to him, "Well, Prime Minister, you live in the neighbourhood. Tell me, Prime Minister, what's your assessment of the situation in Afghanistan?" He must have said nothing for a full minute. Then he finally lifted his great head and looked me in the eye, and he said to me, "Difficult." Difficult. That is all you can say. You're a leader, and you just say difficult. He was defeated at the next election. I can't imagine Kevin Rudd being so short of words if anybody asked him a question. So then, so I give you those two examples of leaders who I thought well, of course, in the case of the King of Saudi Arabia, had reached that position through heredity. In the case of the Indian Prime Minister, though, interestingly enough, in a democracy, had risen to the top and was seen through his silence. This is an interesting point. It's not true in our society, but he was seen through the use of silence as profound. So how about that? And it wasn't obvious that he had any other particular and great skills. So people, I said earlier, some told you about some of the more disappointing leaders I've had to deal with, but I have dealt with some who are quite inspiring. Now, here is somebody who I think you would feel quite poorly about, and that is President George W. Bush. I think if we had a vote here, and we're not going to have a vote here, you can all vote when the election comes. But if we were to have a vote here on whether you think President Bush is a good thing or a bad thing, you would, I'm guessing, but you'd probably think on the whole he wasn't too good. You didn't really approve of President George W. Bush. Let me tell you, I think actually he had a lot of qualities of very substantial, what I would identify as leadership qualities. And I'll come back to those in a minute. But he was certainly a good-humoured and a decent man, but he didn't quite fall into the category of my own wife, because in September 2007, he came to Australia. And John Howard had a dinner for him and invited his wife Jeanette and George and Laura, I think her name is, Bush, and Condi Rice was there, and Peter Costello and his wife Tanya, and I think Mark Vaile and his wife as well. Mark Vaile was then the leader of the National Party. And we were standing around at Kirribilli House. You know, that's the Prime Minister's residence, in official residence in Sydney. And John Howard spent a lot of time there. And we're standing around having a drink, and Condi Rice said to me and my wife, who were talking to her, Nikki, that's the name of my wife, Nikki, would you like to meet President Bush? And Nikki, she really is a self-effacing and a modest woman, though she's becoming rather bumptious because she's English and she thinks the English are better at sport than us. And the reason she thinks that is because they are. She is self-effacing, and she said, look, I mean, honestly, Condi, I wouldn't know what to say to the President of the United States. But Condi insisted you must go and meet him. And I'm sort of saying, yes, go along and meet the President, and it'll be exciting for you. She goes up to him, shake hands with him, and he's absolutely charming to her, chats to her in an animated sort of way. And then I suppose for fear of a moment of silence, and I'm standing there and the Secretary of State of the United States is standing there, I'm the #1 diplomat for Australia, she's my wife, she turns to President Bush and she said, Mr. President, what's it like to be the most unpopular person in the world? And I mean, to take up a word from Rick's speech, I thought to myself, fuck! What is she saying? But it was just a bubble that came out of my head, because in front of John Howard, you would never say, fuck. You would never drop the F-bomb. But I make the point because I couldn't believe my wife could say something like that. It's interesting, though, because to get to a serious point, George Bush's answer to her was to shrug his shoulders and say, well, you know, it's all about politics. My job is to do the right thing. My job isn't to do the popular thing. And I'm confident in what I do. The next morning, I was at a breakfast with John Howard and with George Bush and the Japanese Prime Minister of the time and the foreign ministers at the Intercontinental Hotel in Sydney. And at the end of this breakfast, George Bush said to me, Alexander, I'd just like to have a word with you. I thought, well, that's pretty unusual. The President of the United States wants to take me aside to have a word with me, some CIA briefing or something. What could this be about? He said, I enjoyed talking to your wife last night. I blush. I think, oh, my God, he's just trying to be polite. Poor old bag. She got it a bit wrong last night. But he said, that wife of yours, Alexander, she's a real pistol. So that's how they say it down there in Texas, I thought to myself. But anyway, Pistol Nick, she was known for a while, though she's moved on from that. What do we look for realistically in leaders, whether they're leaders in politics or they're leaders in other fields, in the fields that some of you are in politics, I know, and have been, but in other fields. I think the first thing you look for is something quite simple. It's a capacity to understand and understand very well the environment that you're operating in. So great leaders that I've met, I think George Bush was actually a very good leader, Tony Blair, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, the President of Indonesia, Koizumi, the Prime Minister of Japan. Half of you will agree and half of you won't agree. John Howard, I think, was a very good leader. Sir Robert Menzies, who, yes, good on you, yay. Bring back the Howard government. Sir Robert Menzies made this speech that I'm making tonight. He made this speech many years ago when he was Prime Minister. He had all the qualities of, in my view, of a great leader. I know David Cox is here, former Labor member for Kingston, so let's chuck in a couple of Labor great leaders. Right, I've chucked them in, now moving on. No, seriously. Seriously, I thought Bob Hawke and Paul Keating were both pretty good leaders of the Labor Party, and I think Bob Hawke is the best leader the Labor Party has had, actually. I thought he was a good leader. These are all people who understood the environment they operated in. They knew what the issues were, they knew what the trends, not only in their own country, but the trends in the international society really were. And they also understood something you always have to understand certainly in government, economics. You need to understand economics and what the economic trends are. And a lot of leaders, you know, frankly, they don't try to understand, they don't read, they don't learn, they don't understand, they are opportunists. They are people who have no particular reason for wanting to be in positions of leadership except for self-aggrandizement. Now, you know, I think you could be excused for thinking that in the Western world is becoming an increasingly common phenomenon. And I think there's something to be said for that, because leaders are under different pressures today from the pressures they used to be under. They are subject to almost constant scrutiny from the 24-hour media, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, I don't know how many of you follow Facebook and Twitter, but I put my name, a search in for my name into Twitter, and Twitter's a bit of an understatement when you see what they say about me. I'd say a huge fusillade of abuse. It's interesting, this, a huge fusillade of abuse every time you go and do anything in the media. And leaders see this, or at least their staff do, and they're told, well, you know, you made a speech about industrial relations reform or foreign policy, it's gone down very badly, mate, you better not, I mean, and leaders start to become spooked by this sort of constant reaction of the public, rather than worrying not so much about the immediate reactions of the public, but focusing instead on what they understand to be the fundamental issues and, of course, importantly, how to solve them. That's why real leaders, and the headmaster sort of made this point, real leaders are people who have that old-fashioned word, courage. They tell people what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. Some of you loved her, some of you loathed her, but Margaret Thatcher had huge qualities of leadership. And do you know what Margaret Thatcher did? She read the newspapers, what, every morning at 6 o'clock? Did she bound out of bed and see, gosh, there's a picture of me in the front of the paper today? Can you imagine anybody who's a Prime Minister who would think like that? Yes, you're right, you can. She would, no names, I'm being very bipartisan, but she only ever read the newspapers on Saturday mornings. She never read the newspapers at all during the week because she knew if she focused on commentary, if she focused on public opinion every day during the week, she'd lose track of doing her job. And that is a hugely important message about leadership. You must focus on what you think needs to be done, not always worrying about the reviews. If you're a great actor, You, of course, know there are going to be reviews, but you're concentrating on your performance, not on the reviews that come. I think the leaders that, have inspired me are the people, not the people who want to be loved. We all would like to be loved, wouldn't we? It would be nice to be loved. I've always thought that. I've never been loved, but I've always thought, my wife maybe, my mum. But a leader is somebody who only needs to win respect. You need to respect the leader. You don't particularly need to like or love them. And the last point I'd make, as we've heard a lot of speeches tonight, but the last point I'd make is I think temperament is enormously important in leadership. There was an American jurist called Wendell Holmes who coined a very well-known phrase that to be a great leader you need a second-class intellect and a first-class temperament. Now, Rick tells us that he didn't do very well at school and is rather suggesting he had, in those days, though things have obviously changed, a second-class intellect. But mate, you'd probably make a great leader because you've obviously got a superb temperament. And that's the big point, isn't it? The big point is, I'm not sure about the second-class intellect. I mean, I think you probably do need a first-class intellect to be a truly great leader. But you certainly need to have a good temperament. You certainly need to be calm. My mother knew Sir Robert Menzies very well. I said to her last night when I was thinking about this speech, did you ever see Sir Robert Menzies just start screaming with rage? Did you ever see Sir Robert Menzies shouting as he was preparing to do a TV interview in, whatever language he could speak other than English? Sir Robert Menzies knew Latin very well, but there weren't many Romans watching TV in those days. But in any case, did you ever see Sir Robert Menzies lose it? And that was her point. You never saw it. You never saw John Howard just explode into paroxysms of rage. I saw him get pretty irritated on occasions, not, of course, with me. But on occasions I saw him get pretty irritated and disappointed, but shouting and throwing things around the room, no. So I actually do think a leader is someone, if you like, who has a sense, whatever they're thinking inside, a sense of calm. If you want to be a leader, always look as though you're in control, even if you know in your heart you are totally out of control. It's very important advice that I'd give. So in conclusion, let me just say this. I think there's an old saying in politics, there's a three-way test. You know, those who are Rotarians know about these, it's four-way tests, I think, in Rotary, but you know about these tests. A leader, first of all, has to, or a politician to get elected, if you like, but a leader has to show that they have the intelligence and the capacity to understand the issues. Secondly, they have to demonstrate pretty good character. Not too much womanising, or menising, I suppose. You have to be gender neutral about it. Not too much. You don't come across a lot of menisers, do you? Unfortunately. Not being corrupt, not misbehaving in totally irresponsible ways. Character is a really important issue. And the last thing that, really inspires people about a leader is this sense that I, as a voter, I'm not just important because you want my vote. I'm important because you care about me. And the great leaders are people who genuinely care about you, not people who only care about themselves. So again, thank you very much for having me at your wonderful evening and your magnificent school, and I wish you all well for the next year ahead. Thank you.
We've actually got a bit of time for some questions. I think they're could be some microphones floating around the room, so if anyone has any questions for Mr. Downer, please stand up.
How you going, Alex?
I'm good, mate.
Did George drink much piss?
Well, how can I answer a question like that? Have you? Yeah, no, I think he actually is a teetotaler. Because, you know, he had a huge drinking problem when he was younger. And we're thinking about this. He had a huge drinking problem and then he decided he better address that and he gave it up altogether. Bob Hawke was the same, I think. Bob Hawke had a huge drinking problem and I think he might drink again a bit now, but... So there you are. It's a good question. It's a good question.
Alex, how do you think Australia is perceived on the world stage with the current shenanigans of the Labor Party?
Well, I don't think, to be honest about this, and I hope I can give you an objective view here, I don't think that much of the world cares very much about this constant change of the Prime Ministership, because you do see that in quite a lot of countries, particularly in Europe. You see Prime Ministers change from time to time. I think that the world sees Australia, this would be a good answer for the Labor Party, really. I think the world sees Australia as a hugely successful country, a peaceful and quiet country, and not a country that causes a lot of trouble. But I also think the world is quite surprised by how tumultuous and turbulent our politics seems to be. And when I go to the UK or the US or parts of Europe and Asia, people often ask me, so what's exactly going on in your politics? There is a certain curiosity, and that's all it really is, about the behaviour of politicians in Australia. But in a sense, I don't think this reflects terribly badly on the country, which shows that there's more to a country than its politicians, as should be the case. So, no, I think Australia has an exceptionally good reputation as a country around the world because it's seen to be remote, geographically remote, but hugely successful, which it is.
Mr. Downer, when are you going to run for Prime Minister?
Well, I really enjoyed I'll be frank with you, right? I really enjoyed my time in politics, and I had a huge privilege of being the Foreign Minister for 12 years. But I want to explain to you that if you're a senior cabinet minister, all you ever see of that is a grab here and there on television. But there is an immense amount of work to do. It is absolutely a 24/7 commitment. And you're under a lot of pressure as well. You're under pressure from the media, pressure from your own party, pressure from within your portfolio, and even the opposition, although, of course, during my years, the opposition was not much pressure, but even the opposition puts you under pressure as well. Well, I had Kevin Rudd as the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs for a lot of the time I was there. And that's one of the reasons why I know him so well. And love him.
You couldn't say you wouldn't do a better job than him now, really.
But you know, you can't keep doing these things forever. And 12 years as a foreign minister was more than enough for me. Thank you very much. But thank you for your question. That's it.
Alexander, thanks for a great speech. You started to allude to it at the end of your speech. Can you elaborate on the three greatest values you think are in a great leader?
Yeah, look, I think that there's no doubt that a great leader is somebody who intellectually understands what the key issues of the time are, and I'm going to spend time tonight going through what I think they are, but I don't just mean domestic issues. We might think here about improving our productivity, dealing with the slowing down in the resources boom, how we're going to restructure our manufacturing sector and so on, understanding how all that fits into what's happening in Asia, in America, understanding how that fits in with broader global intellectual trends, and having a very simple and a clear view how to address those things. So this is what I've often said about Ronald Reagan. You know, Ronald Reagan was not an intellectual. Ronald Reagan, it's often said, only had 3 ideas. The thing about Ronald Reagan is the 3 ideas he had were good ideas. And he implemented his 3 ideas. He got people to do it. A great leader doesn't have to do all the implementation in detail. A great leader has to have a plan. A great leader has to explain his or her plan to the public and has to have the courage to do it. It doesn't poll very well, but I'm going to tell you this is what we need to do. Now ask yourself about leaders today, whichever leaders you want to think about. Are they doing what they're doing because in their hearts they believe this has to be done, or have they just done a focus group and thought that might be a good idea? That is a real test. And finally, I made the point earlier, they have to be sincere and care about you, care about the community in the country, and maybe even broader than that. And, you know, that's where I think sometimes they look to me, looking at leaders around the world, no particular names here, they care more about themselves than they care about their communities.
Mr. Downer, thank you for a very intelligent and erudite speech. First of all, you mentioned that you feel unloved. Well, I love you.
Well, you're very
and I know a lot of
yourself.
people who do. LUV. Secondly, you started off your talk talking about the Australian test side failure. Do you think it's a fair playing ground where England has 3 times our population as a breeding ground in cricket? And do you think that Australia should be doing more to push its cricket in terms of government support and training and what have you to bring us back up to that standard that's required?
Well, I know England has 3 times the Britain has 3 times the population of Australia. What, 63 million people to our 23 million people. But remember, for the British, we'll focus on the English because we're talking about the England cricket team. There's a bit less than that. Then the population is a bit smaller. There are 5 million people who live in Scotland, about 3 million in Wales. So still, you're talking about approximately 60 million in England. The thing is, they are obsessed with soccer, or what they call football. Football, they don't play football at all, they play soccer. Is anyone here from the Adelaide United Football Club will murder me for saying that. But it is an absolute and understandable national obsession there. Cricket is a much lesser game in England than it is in Australia. So it's a bit more complicated than just the population, I suspect. I don't think we should fall back on that. After all, we have beaten England for generations at cricket, and we've always had a population about the third and even less than that of the size of England. So I don't think that's an excuse. What do I really think? What I really think is 2 things have happened here. We have seen the retirement not just of great players, which we have done, but great leaders. I mean, we had a coach like Buchanan, who was a simply superb coach. And let's hope Buff will be as good. You know, good on him. I hope he will be. But we lost Buchanan and we ended up with weaker coaches. Now, here, some of you will kill me for saying this, but I may as well say it. I don't think Michael Clarke is up to the job of captain. I really don't. I'm sorry. He is the fifth best batsman in the world, Michael Clarke. And he is. He made over 50 the other day at Lord's in the second innings. He's a great batsman. But because of his relationship with Simon Katich isn't playing in the team. He makes 200 for Lancashire. 200 for Lancashire Well, our top 6 can't make 200 in each of 2 innings. So, and why? Because Clark and Kadich have a bad relationship, and apparently he and Watson. Come on, if you're a leader, you don't have to love the people you play with. You have to work with them and lead them. And that's as true of cricket as it is of politics. So I don't want to knock it. I hope this tonight won't be remembered for me saying Michael Clark's not up to the job, but honestly, come on, we're Australians. We always say what we think. He's not. And it's too late to change him now. They'll have to see out this miserable series. At least there's still quite a few days to go till they play again. And when England come out here, and we see them playing at the new Adelaide Oval, well, let's hope that they've done a bit of, the Australian team has done a bit of leadership restructuring. And the last point I'd make is, unfortunately, other countries, in particular England, have learnt from us how to get better at sport. And they put huge amounts of additional money from their lottery into sports. They've restructured their sports. They've stolen a lot of our coaches, and it's proving harder for us to compete. That is, of course, irreversible. Unless, we do what we do in cycling and start getting into more drugs. That's enough. Is there anyone else?
Oh, we're
There's a guy down there. We'll do that one and then...
We'll have one more question. These fellows
Hello.
at the back have been waiting for a while.
Mr. Downer, I'm going to ignore your criticism, Michael Clark, because he's one of my men, but very popular at this table. I'm going to change the topic. Tony Abbott or Malcolm Turnbull, who would you vote for at the next election?
Well, I live in the electorate of Jamie Briggs, so I'll be voting. I'll let you into a secret. I've decided, I've thought about this, but I've made a decision. At the next election, I'm going to vote Liberal. Now, some of you will and some of you won't, but believe me, I am definitely going to. It's not a hard decision for me. Of the two, look, I know them both very well. Let me quote a friend of mine who was one of the Labor cabinet ministers who resigned the other day when Julia Gillard was overthrown by Kevin Rudd, because he didn't want to work with Kevin Rudd. One wonders why. And he said to me, we were sitting having a chat about this, and he was morose, he's depressed about it, he's resigning from Parliament now. And he said to me, Tony Abbott might not be hugely popular with the punters, but he's the most formidable politician in a generation. And what did he mean by that? He went on to say, I said, what do you mean by that? He said, he has absolutely destroyed us. I think if you're at Labor, Tony Abbott is understandably a bit of a hate figure. Why? Because he brought down Rudd, he brought down Gillard, and, well, I don't know whether he'll bring down Rudd or not next time. Malcolm Turnbull, a huge talent. And I think what the Liberals need to do is project their team and say, a vote for Abbott is a vote for Turnbull and Jamie Briggs. And that's the way, because he's my local member, and that's the way for them to present the case. The one thing they shouldn't do is go down the path of the Labor Party and every time someone gets ahead in a poll, say, let's change the leader. Let's move to someone else. No. Stick with it. Be true and strong, and people might not love him, but at least people will respect him. Okay. Thank you.